This lesson is going to begin our unit on simplifying square roots, or radicals as the book calls it. Let's start off with a basic one, for instance the square root of 12. Now the whole idea of this is that we don't get any decimals. We know the square root of 12 is not going to be a whole number because 12 is not a perfect square. If we were to square root 12 out in the calculator, we would get something like 3.48 something. Let's double check, see what I would get. Square root of 12 gets me 3.46, so it's some approximation. And we are trying to stay away from approximations, so we're going to break this down using the multiplication property of square roots. We're going to see what goes into 12. Well, some factors of 12 could be 6 and 2, but I can't use 6 and I can't use 2 because neither of those are perfect squares. Remember, when we break these apart, one of them has to be a perfect square, so 6 and 2 won't work. What else makes 12? How about 4 and a 3? Well, 4 is the perfect square. And if we square root each of these, the square root of 4 is 2. The square root of 3 we can't do, so we just leave it as the square root of 3. And here is your finalized answer. That's called 2 root 3. And you're done. Let's try one or two more of these to kind of get in the rhythm. How about the square root of 20? Well, let's think of some numbers that go into 20. Could I use 10 and 2? Of course not, because 10 is not a perfect square, and 2 is not a perfect square. So we got to go back to the drawing board, find two more numbers that multiply together to make 20. And I know what you're thinking. It would be 4 and 5. And you're right. The square root of 4 is 2, and the square root of 5 stays as the square root of 5. Here is your final answer. 2 root 5. And lastly, let's take a look at an even bigger one. Let's say the square root of, let's say 80. Now 80's got a bunch of different possibilities. Let's try, how about 8 and 10? Oops. 8 and 10. Would 8 and 10 work? No, because you can't square root an 8, can't square root a 10. So 8 and 10 won't work. What else makes 80? How about 20 and 4? Which of those is the perfect square? Yeah, 4 is. So we'll square root the 4. It becomes a 2 on the outside. We square root of 20, which we can't do, so it just stays square root of 20. But in this case, we're not done yet, because 20 can be broken up even farther. Let me get a different color. If you can break 20 down, I think we did that in the previous problem, 20 breaks down into a root 4 and a root 5. So let's go ahead and do that. 4 and 5. Which of those was the perfect square? Well, the 4 is the perfect square. So we're going to square root the 4 and square root the 5. The square root of 4 is 2. So that 2 is going to come all the way to the front, but there's already a 2 out there. So what do you think those two 2's do together? Do they add together or do they multiply together? Well, if you guessed multiply, you're right. So this square root of 4 becomes a 2. That 2 floats all the way to the front and multiplies with this 2 to make 4. This square root of 5, you cannot go any farther, so it just stays the square root of 5. So you see what happens here. We did two splits. We split it into a 4 and a 20 first, and then we did to a 4 and a 5 again. What does that mean? All of these other ones required only one split. 20 was a 4 and a 5. 12 was a 4 and a 3. Why did this one require two splits? Well, if you go all the way back up to the front, this very first split that we did, you notice we took out a 4 because 4 is the perfect square. The reason why we have two splits here is because 4 was not the biggest perfect square. We could have broken this down into two different numbers besides 20 and 4. So let me go ahead, bear with me here. I'm going to leave the answer so you know what the final answer would be. So instead of breaking it into a 4 and a 20, let's break this into two different numbers. How about a 16 and a 5? What is the square root of 16? Well, the square root of 16 is 4. And the square root of 5 stays as the square root of 5. So really it doesn't matter how many times you have to break it down. Just know that you have to break it down all the way until this number is no longer able to be broken apart anymore. Let's try one more together. Let's take, for instance, the square root of 50. What does 50 break apart to? Let's get a different color. Can I use 5 and 10? No, 5 and 10 won't work because 5 is not a perfect square, and 10 is not a perfect square. Even though 5 and 10 do make 50, we can't use them. So what else is going to make a 50? How about a 25 and a 2? Which of those right here is a perfect square? I hope you're seeing that it's the 25. So we're going to square root both of them. Square root of 25 is 5. Square root of 2 stays as the square root of 2. And we always double check. Can this 2 be broken down any farther? And the answer is no. Once you've come to the end of the road, that is your final answer. 5 root 2.